This was all so that the game couldn't be mistaken for the real world. As a result of all the limitations, fantasy worlds featuring sex hadn't really caught on. But here he could smell the reality of that hit Momonga so hard it completely blew away all his wall. What about work tomorrow? And what if I can't get out of here type of worries? If this weren't reality, just in terms of the bandwidth that would be required to run this fantasy, it'd be impossible. His mouth was bone dry, but he swallowed anyway. Even if he couldn't understand it, his mind had already accepted it. Finally, he let his hand fall limply from Albedo's full chest. He felt he'd been groping her a bit longer than necessary, but he told himself it was something he had to do for confirmation. It certainly wasn't because she was so soft he couldn't take his hand away. At least, probably not. Sorry, Albedo. Ah! She exhaled hotly, and he could feel why her cheeks had turned so red. Then, she said, looking slightly askance, so here it is, my first time. Huh? Momonga let out a confused yelp in spite of himself. It took him a moment to understand what she was saying. First time? For what? And what's with that look on her face? What shall I do with my clothes? What? Would you like me to take them off myself? Or did you want to do it? If I keep them on, they might get dirty. Oh, but if my lord prefers it that way, I have no objections. Finally, her words sank in. Actually, Momonga wondered if he even had any brain left for them to sink into. Once he understood where all this was coming from, it grated on him. Stop. Stop it, Albedo. Yes, sir. Right now we don't have time to be doing such things. My humble apologies. I shouldn't have prioritized desire when we're having some sort of emergency. She jumped away from him and went to prostrate herself, but Momonga put out a hand to stop her. You're fine. It was my fault. All is forgiven, Albedo. More importantly, I have orders for you. Anything you wish, my lord. Contact the floor guardians and tell them to gather at the amphitheatrum in the 6th level 1 hour from now. I will let Aura and Mare know myself, so there is no need to contact them. Understood. To repeat, you would like me to contact all the floor guardians besides those of the 6th level and tell them to meet in the 6th level's amphitheatrum 1 hour from now. Right? Now go? My lord? Albedo turned to leave the throne room with slightly quickened steps. Watching her go, Momonga heaved a tired sigh, and once she had left, he let out an agonized moan. What the hell? It was just a stupid joke. If I'd have known this would happen, I wouldn't have done it. Have I defiled the NPC that Tabula created? He could think of only one reason Albedo would react to him in that way. The text he'd edited into her bio, and she's in love with Momonga. It had to be connected to that. Ah, crap, he groaned. Tabula Smaragdina had put his all into filling that blank canvas with Albedo's backstory. Then, Momonga condescendingly painted over it for his own selfish reasons. And now, this was the result. He felt like he'd vandalized a masterpiece. But he had to put that issue aside for now. Still wincing, though it wasn't obvious, given that his face was a skull, he stood up from the throne. He told himself he could figure that problem out after taking care of the more urgent tasks. Chapter 2. The Floor Guardians 1. Return, Demons of Lemegeton. At Momonga's command, the ultra-rare ore golems returned to their seats and resumed their postures of vigilance on lighter feet than one would expect for their builds. The first thing Momonga had done upon resigning himself to officially wondering whether his fantasy world had indeed become the real one was to guarantee his safety. The NPCs he had met a moment ago all submitted to him, but that didn't mean the ones he would meet next would. Even if they did prove to be allies, there was no telling what dangers might lie ahead. His survival could very well depend on whether or not the tomb's facilities, golems, items, magic, etc., all functioned as in the game or not, which made confirmation of those things his most urgent priority. That should be good for now, Momonga said to himself out of relief as he surveyed the golems. He'd ordered them not to take commands from anyone else, so in the worst-case scenario of an NPC rebellion, he would at least have one way to protect himself. Satisfied with the robust figures of the golems, he looked down at his own finger bones. There were 9 rings on his 10 fingers. The only one that didn't have one was his left ring finger. In Yggdrasil, it was normally only possible to wear 1 ring per hand, but by purchasing an expensive cash store item with a permanent effect, Momonga had gained the ability to wear them on all 10, as well as use all the powers they contained. Not that that made him very special. If a player prioritized being strong, buying that item was a no-brainer. The ring Momonga was looking at now bore the same crest that was embroidered on the scarlet tapestry hanging behind the throne. It was a ring of Ainz Ooal Gown, a magic item that every member of the guild possessed. He wore his on his right ring finger. He could use all the powers of 10 rings, but he'd had to choose which ones when he used the item that allowed him to equip that many. It was impossible to swap after the fact. Compared to his other rings, including the one he wasn't wearing stored in the treasury, this one's power was pretty basic, but he wanted it at the ready, since, in certain circumstances, he used it far more than any of the others. The ring of Ainz Ooal Gown let its wearer teleport freely to almost any named room within the Great Tomb of Nazarick. It was even possible to teleport in from outside. The tomb blocked teleportation magic except for in designated areas, so there was no more useful way to get around. There weren't very many places, save the throne room and the members' individual rooms, that couldn't be teleported to. Without this ring, however, there was no way to get to the treasury. So it wasn't something he would want to be without. Momonga exhaled deeply. He was about to exercise the ring's power, but he wasn't sure what would happen. Would it work as expected? He was anxious, but had to know. He unleashed the power, and his vision went dark, like he'd blinked. The scenery changed. Now he was in a dimly lit passage. The end was blocked by a barred gate. White artificial light came in through the gaps. "Success," he murmured, relieved that he'd been able to teleport. He set off, walking down the broad, high-ceilinged passage toward the gate. The stone floor caused his footsteps to reverberate loudly. Flickering torchlight sent shadows dancing along the walls, making it seem like there was more than one of him. As he neared the gate, his nostrils, which should have just been holes leading to nowhere, were invaded by scent. He stopped to breathe in and out. A pungent green odor and the scent of earth. This was the smell of deep forest. Having his nose working again, like it had before with Albedo, even though it should have been impossible in the game's fantasy world, made Momonga feel even more strongly that this place was now reality. But with no lungs and no respiratory tract, how am I even breathing? He racked his brains, but soon realized trying to reason the problem out was ridiculous and abandoned the idea. When he got close enough, the gate drew quickly up into the ceiling like a well-timed automatic door. Passing beneath, Momonga saw the Colosseum, with its multiple levels of spectator seating encircling its central arena. It was an oval of 615 by 510 feet, 157 feet high, identical to the Colosseum built in Rome during the imperial period. Continual light was cast in various locations, throwing enough white light that he could look around the area and see as if it were high noon. There were too many seats to count, and in them a great many clods of dirt, no sign of movement from the golems. This place was called the Amphitheatrum. The actors were captured raiders, the audience was made up of golems, and in the VIP seating would be the members of Ainz Ooal Gown. What was on the program? A slaughter, of course. With the exception of the 1,500 in that huge raid, every intruder, no matter how strong, had met their end here. Momonga walked into the center of the arena, gazing up at the pitch-black night sky. If there hadn't been any light, he probably would have been able to see the stars. Of course, this was the sixth level of the Great Tomb of Nazarick. Being underground, the sky hanging overhead was a false one, but it was made with quite a lot of data, so it changed with the passage of time, and there was even an accurately arcing sun that rose and set. Was the reason that even this fake sky could take the weight off Momonga's chest and relax him, because under all the graphics he was still human? Maybe also because it was programmed according to the particularities of a former guild member. He wished he could just stay and take it easy, but the situation didn't allow that. Momonga glanced around. They're not here. The twins should be managing this place, but just then he felt someone looking at him. Yeah! At the same time, the shout sounded. A figure hopped down from the VIP seating. That was the equivalent of 6 stories up, but the figure flipped in midair and made a feather-light landing. It wasn't due to magic, but simply great physical technique. Having absorbed the full shock of the landing by just bending its legs, the figure flashed a proud grin and made peace signs with both hands. Victory! It was a child of perhaps 10 who had jumped down. The most apt descriptor for that smile was radiant like the sun. She had that kind of androgynous cuteness only children have. Her golden hair reflected light in a way that made it look almost like she had a halo. Her eyes, bright like a puppy's, were 2 different colors, forest green and ocean blue. As a dark elf, a relative of the elf race, her ears were long and pointed, her skin tan. She wore fitted, dark red dragon scale light armor, top and bottom, over a layer of basic leather protective gear. On top of that, she sported a white vest with golden threading, featuring the crest of Ainz Ooal Gown on the chest, and white pants to match. A big golden acorn hung from her neck. Her hands were protected by gloves with magic metal plates on the backs of the palms. Whips were bundled at her waist and right shoulder, and across her back she carried a bow with peculiar decorations on the grip, handle, and limbs. "Oh, it's Aura." Momonga murmured her name in recognition. Aura Bellafiora was one of the guardians of the 6th level, a beast tamer ranger who could employ fantastical and magical creatures. She came running toward him with short steps that somehow carried her crazily fast, like an animal running flat out. She closed the distance in an instant and put the brakes on. Her sporty shoes, inlaid on top with scarletite, sent up a cloud of dust as they scraped along the ground. If she had calculated it out so that not a speck would reach Momonga, she'd done a brilliant job. Phew. She wiped her forehead even though she wasn't sweating and smiled like a puppy who wanted to play. Then she greeted Momonga in that ever so slightly too loud voice that only children have. "Welcome to the floor I guard, Lord Momonga." Compared to Sebas and Albedo, she was less deferential and more familiar, but that was actually more comfortable for Momonga. He didn't have much experience with all of this, so being overly revered only made it harder to know how to act. He wasn't getting any hostility from Aura's ear-to-ear grin, and Sense Enemy didn't pick up anything either. His emergency plan had been to attack with full power and promptly retreat, but it seemed like that would be unnecessary. "Thanks. I thought I'd come bother you for a bit." "What are you talking about? You are the master of the Great Tomb of Nazarick, its absolute ruler. No one would ever feel bothered to receive a visit from you, Lord Momonga." "Oh, by the way, I see that you're here, Aura, but..." As if taking a cue, Aura turned on her heel, glared up at the VIP seats, and shouted, "Hurry up, come on, Lord Momonga is here, you're being rude." Up in the darkness of the VIP seats, Momonga saw something bouncing up and down in a fidgety way. "Oh, Mare's over there, huh?" "Yes, Lord Momonga, he's such a wimp. Get down here," a weak little voice replied. In fact, it was a wonder they could even hear it, considering their distance from the VIP seats, but it was made possible by the magical necklace Aura had equipped. Sis, there's in no way," Aura sighed, exasperated. "Oh, Lord Momonga, he's just a bit of a coward. He's not being rude on purpose." Of course, I know that, Aura. I've never for a moment doubted your loyalty to me. Momonga nodded and gave a kind answer to put her at ease. Adults need to know their inner feelings as well as what their outward-facing stance would be. Sometimes it was necessary to tell a little lie. Aura seemed relieved, but a moment later she turned in anger to the figure up in the VIP seats. Our elite lord has graced us with his presence, and one of the floor guardians can't even come out to meet him? That's the worst, and you know it. If you don't have the courage to move your own butt, we're going to try it with my foot next. I'll take the stairs. You mean you're going to keep Lord Momonga waiting even longer? Get over here already. Ah, fine. Here goes. It was a pretty pathetic little shout for someone trying to psych himself up, but he did hop down. Another dark elf. The difference between him and Aura was like night and day, but although he stumbled upon landing, it didn't seem like he'd taken any damage from the fall. He must have neutralized it with pure physical ability. Then, he came running at a speed that matched the sound of his light footfalls. He was giving his all, naturally, but was still hopelessly slow compared to Aura. She must have been thinking the same thing, because her brow began to twitch. Hurry up! I am! The child who finally arrived looked just like Aura. Same hair color and length, same eye colors, same facial features. They couldn't be anything but twins. But if Aura was the sun, then Mar was the moon. He trembled as if expecting to be chewed out at any moment. Momonga was a bit surprised by both of them. The Mar he knew wasn't like this at all. Of course, NPCs generally just stood there rigidly with their fixed expressions. It didn't matter how long of a bio they were given, it was never reflected in their personalities. Yet here they were before him, two dark elves with rapid-fire emotions. So this is how Teapot meant for them to be. Bubbling Teapot was the guild member who had set up Aura and Mare. He wished he could show them to her now. Sorry to keep you waiting, Lord Momonga. Mare looked up at him nervously. The scales of his upper body dragon armor were more indigo than blue. He also wore a short mantle of dark green that almost exactly matched the leaves of the forest. Most of his clothes were white like Aura's, but he was wearing a skirt so short it left a little skin showing, only a little because of his white stockings. His acorn necklace looked just like Aura's, but silver. He wasn't as heavily armed as his sister. In his hands, which wore slender white gloves with a silky sheen, he clutched a gnarled staff of black wood, and that was it. Mar Bello Fiore. He was the other guardian of the 6th level. Momonga smiled kindly, not that his empty eye sockets showed it, and took a good look at the two of them. Aura proudly puffed out her chest while Mare trembled under his gaze. Satisfied that they were indeed the crystallization of his guildmate's intentions, he nodded several times and then spoke. More than anything, I'm just glad to see you're both doing well. Yeah, we're great. Just lately it's been so boring. It'd be nice if some raiders would come for a change. I don't want any raiders to come. They're scary. Mare's words wiped the excitement off Aura's face, and she sighed. Sorry, Lord Momonga. Please excuse us. Mare, come with me a minute. Momonga gave a slight nod, and Aura moved away a bit, dragging Mare by his pointy ears. Ow, Aura, that hurts! Then she started hissing at him. Even at a distance, Momonga could tell she was giving him a scolding. Raiders? I'm actually with Mare on that one. I'd at least like them to wait until I get my feet on the ground, he thought as he watched the twins. The next thing he knew, Mare was sitting erect with his legs tucked under him, and Aura stood before him lecturing. The situation was reminiscent of the power struggle between the two of his former guildmates, who were sisters, and he smiled wryly. Geez, but I don't think Peroncino made Mare. Maybe Teapot had the idea that one should obey one's elder sister? Actually, now that I think of it, both Aura and Mare have died once before. I wonder what happened with that. In the raid where 1,500 men attacked, the huge army got as far as the 8th level. In other words, Aura and Mare died attempting to hold the 6th level. But did they remember it? What does death mean for the two of them? In Yggdrasil, characters who died lost 5 levels and dropped one of their equipped items. That meant that characters level 5 or under were destroyed. Player characters were spared destruction by divine grace and stopped at level 1. Of course, that was speaking strictly of the rules of the game. In actuality, spells such as Resurrection and Raise Dead could ease the level penalty, and cash store items let players get off with just losing some experience points. In the case of an NPC, it was even simpler. The guild could revive a character with no penalty by paying a fee according to its level. Dying to lose levels ended up being a favorite way for people to rebuild their characters. Certainly in a game where an enormous amount of experience was required, losing even one level would be an extreme punishment. But in Yggdrasil, it was pretty easy to rack up levels until the upper 90s. The developers set it up so that losing levels wasn't such a terrifying thing. Their intent was not for people to be so scared of losing levels that they didn't want to explore, but for them to venture bravely into new territory. Under those rules, were these two who had died in the 1,500-man raid now different people, or were they the reincarnations of those exact characters? He did want to know, but he also felt like there wasn't any reason to wake sleeping dogs. That huge raid might have been a traumatizing experience for them. He also wondered if it was really necessary to prod so much just to satisfy his own curiosity when Aura wasn't showing any hostility. After all, these were lovable NPCs that his guildmate made. He could talk to Aura about it after all the other pending matters had been taken care of. Plus, it was possible that the entire concept of death had changed entirely. In the real world, dying was the end, naturally. But what if that were different here? Momonga thought he'd like to experiment with it in the near future, but he couldn't determine how high a priority it should be until he had more information. It was probably best to just put it on the back burner for now. At this point, he didn't know how different this world was from Yggdrasil, so all he had was a great many questions. While he was pondering all of this, Aura had continued berating Mara. Momonga couldn't help but feel bad for him. He never said the kid deserved this much scolding. When the two sisters in his guild had fought, he had kept his mouth shut and just watched, but now he was different. How about we leave it at that? Lord Momonga, but Mars not fulfilling his duties as a Gua. I have no issue with his behavior. Aura, I understand very well how you feel, including your thinking that as a floor guardian, Mare shouldn't be so timid, especially around me. But should the great tomb of Nazarick be raided, I believe that both you and Mare will fight fearlessly in the face of death to protect it. If he'll do what needs to be done when the time comes, you don't need to scold him so much. Momonga, who had walked closer to them, grabbed Mare's arm and stood him up. And Mare, you should thank your big sister for being so kind. Even if I were upset, after seeing her chew you out like that, there'd be nothing I could do but forgive you. Mare's eyes widened and he looked at his sister in surprise. Aura chimed in hastily. Huh? No, that's not why I did it. I didn't think anything like that about you. It doesn't matter, Aura. No matter what your intent was, your kindness came through. I just want you to know that I have no misgivings about Mare being a floor guardian. Huh? Okay. Thank you, Lord Munga. Thank you. He accepted their bows, but couldn't help but get the willies from the way their eyes lit up when they looked at him. He'd pretty much never been looked at with such admiration, so he cleared his throat to hide both his hesitation and embarrassment. More importantly, Aura, I wanted to ask you about what you were mentioning before. You said you're bored when no one is raiding us? Well, no, I mean... From her backpedaling, Momonga could see he'd phrased his question badly. No, I'm not accusing you of anything. Please tell me honestly. Well, yes, it is a little boring. There isn't anyone strong enough to train with around here, Aura answered, looking up at him, poking the tips of her index fingers together. As a guardian, Aura's level was, of course, 100. There were not so many level 100s in the dungeon, including Aura and Mare, 9 NPCs, plus one other. What about sparring with Mare? Mare had scrunched up as though he were trying to hide, and now a shudder went through his whole body. His eyes glistened as he shook his head no. He was terrified. Aura reacted with a sigh again. As she exhaled, a sickeningly sweet fragrance filled the air. It was different from Albedo's, a syrupy aroma that seemed to cling somehow. Recalling her powers, Momonga took a step back. "Oh, I'm sorry, Lord Momonga." Realizing what had happened, Aura flapped her arms around to clear the air. One of Aura's passive skills as a beast tamer was the ability to use both buffs and debuffs at the same time. The effects drifted into the air on her breath and could have a radius of dozens of feet to 100 or more. Using an additional skill could make the range unbelievably huge. In Yggdrasil, buff and debuff icons would pop up, so players understood clearly when they were in effect. But in their current situation, they problematically did not. It's okay now. I turned it off." "Oh, but Lord Momonga, you're undead, so psychic stuff shouldn't have any effect on you." That's the way it had been in Yggdrasil. Psychic abilities had neither good nor bad effects on the undead. Was I in range just now? Irk. Aura scrunched up her shoulders in fear of the coming rebuke. Even Mar shrank a bit. "I'm not angry, Aura," Momonga said as kindly as he could. "Relax. Did you think you could affect me with a skill you weren't even using seriously? I'm just asking if I was in range or not." "Got it. You were in range." From Aura's voice, filled with relief, Momonga realized how terrible and awe-inspiring he was to her. A prickling pressure assailed him under his clothes in the area where his stomach would have been if he'd had one. What if I end up weaker because of this? The thought of it made him want to run away at full speed. And what was the effect? I think the one from just now was, yes, fear. He didn't feel fear. In Yggdrasil, friendly fire had been disabled, so players couldn't harm members of their guild or other teammates. Here, however, there was a high possibility that that had changed. He knew it would be good to confirm one way or the other right away. "I thought it used to be the case that your powers couldn't have any negative effects on people in the same guild group." Huh? Aura's blank expression was matched by Mar. Momonga gathered that it hadn't been the case. Must have been my imagination? Yes, but I can control the range of the effects at will, so maybe that's how you misunderstood? So friendly fire was on. The reason Mar hadn't been affected was probably because he was equipped with an item that could neutralize psychic effects. Meanwhile, Momonga's god items didn't have any psychic resistance data in them. So why hadn't he felt fear? He had two guesses: basic resistance based on his ability points, or psychic effects immunity due to a special undead ability. He decided to dig a little deeper, since he wasn't sure which one was correct. "Can you try out some other effects for me?" Aura cocked her head and made an odd, questioning noise. She seemed like a puppy again, so Momonga reached out to pet her in spite of himself. Her smooth, silky hair was delightful to touch. When she didn't seem to mind, he wished he could just stay there petting her forever. Except Mare's glazed stare freaked him out, so he stopped. I wonder what he's feeling. After thinking for a moment, Momonga released his other hand's grip on the staff and stretched it out to pet Mare. Absent-mindedly thinking how the texture of Mare's hair seemed somehow better than Aura's, he petted the both of them until he was quite satisfied. Then, he finally remembered what he'd gone there to do. "Now then, I have a favor to ask. I'm testing out a lot of things at the moment, and I want your cooperation, Aura." At first, the two of them looked like they didn't really know what to do. but by the time he took his hands away, they seemed self-consciously happy and willing. "Okay, understood. Leave it to me, Lord Momonga," Aura gleefully replied. She was enthusiastic to get going, but Momonga held her back. "Before that," he grabbed the floating staff. "Okay, just like before." As he had done when he used the ring's power, he focused his mind on the staff. Of its countless powers, the one Momonga chose was contained within one of its jewels, inside a god artifact, the Moon Orb. Summon Moon Wolf. As the summoning magic activated, 3 beasts oozed into existence out of nowhere. Nothing about this surprised Momonga, since that was how the animation had looked in Yggdrasil. The moon wolves were similar in appearance to Eurasian wolves, except they gave off a silvery light. Momonga could sense a strange connection between these monsters and himself that clearly indicated who was in charge. "Moon wolves?" Aura asked, her voice implying confusion at why he would summon such a weak monster. Moon wolves were extremely fast, so they were often deployed as key units in sneak attacks, but they were only level 20, too weak for Momonga and Aura. But for their purposes right now, these were fine. Weaker was actually better. "Yes, include me in the range of your breath too." "What? Are you sure?" Aura didn't seem okay with it, so he insisted, "It's fine." Things weren't operating completely like they had been in the game anymore, so he couldn't ignore the possibility that Aura's powers weren't working correctly. In order to rule it out, he needed to be hit with her power at the same time as a third party, hence the Moon Wolves. Aura huffed and puffed for a little while, but Momonga didn't feel a thing. Partway through, he turned his back to her and relaxed his mind, but there was still no effect. The Moon Wolves did seem affected, though, so her power must have been working. Therefore, it seemed Momonga was immune to psychic effects. In other words, in Yggdrasil, when subhumans and grotesques reached certain race levels, they gained specific racial abilities. Momonga, who had reached the elite race of Overlord, had the following monster powers: create upper-tier undead, 4 per day, create middle-tier undead, 12 per day, create lower-tier undead, 20 per day, negative touch, aura of despair v insta-death, negative guard, dark soul, raven black halo, immortal blessing, impure providence, black wisdom, evil language proficiency, ability point damage 4, stabbing weapon resistance v, cutting weapon resistance v, greater repel resistance 3, greater physical damage immunity 3, greater magical damage immunity 3, chill, acid, electric attack immunity, magical vision boost, see-through. Add to that the abilities from his class level: boost insta-death magic, master of dark rites, immortal aura, make undead, control undead, fortify undead, etc. He also had the basic undead special abilities: critical hit immunity, psychic effect immunity, no hunger thirst, poison, sickness, sleep, paralysis, insta-death immunity, resistance to ghost magic, physical penalty resistance, breathe anywhere, ability point damage immunity, energy drain immunity, the ability to recover from negative energy, night vision, etc. Of course, he also had weaknesses: justice, light, holy attack vulnerability 4, battering weapon vulnerability 4, holy, justice area, ability point penalty 2, double fire damage, etc. It seemed extremely likely that he still possessed both the basic undead abilities and the special abilities he had gained from leveling up. "I see. That's good enough for now." "I thank you, Aura. Any issues on your end?" "No, everything's fine." "Okay, return." The 3 moon wolves disappeared as if time were rewinding. "Lord Momonga, was that why you came to our floor today?" Aura asked, but Mar nodded that he was curious too. "Oh right, no, I thought I'd do some training today." "Training? You?" Aura's and Mare's eyes practically popped out of their heads. What was this most elite caster, the ruler of the great tomb of Nazarick who dominated all manner of lesser beings, talking about? But Momonga had expected this. Yes, the tap of the staff on the ground accompanying his simple reply was enough for them to understand. Momonga was inwardly pleased that their reaction matched what he'd anticipated. Is that, the legendary you-know-what? The most elite weapon only you can touch? What does she mean by legendary you-know-what? Momonga wondered, but it didn't seem to be anything bad given the sparkle in Mara's eyes. That's right, this is the guild weapon we all created together, the staff of Ainz Ooal Gown. He lifted it into the air, and it sparkled beautifully in the light. It was such a gorgeous display, it was almost as if the staff was showing off, except it was still exuding that ominous black shimmer, so it was hard to see it as anything but evil. Momonga didn't have a body type that could burst with pride, so to speak, but the passion was clear in his voice. The jewels held in each of the 7 snakes' mouths are all god artifacts. Since the items are part of a series, collecting them all yields great power. Gathering them took serious effort and an immense amount of time. In fact, there were many times we thought to quit. How many mobs did we hunt for the drops? Furthermore, the power contained within even just the staff itself surpasses God tier and is on par with a world item. Most impressive of all is its automatic intercept. Ahem. I'm totally rambling. It was only natural to want to brag. He'd crafted it with his guildmates, but since he'd never been able to take it anywhere, he'd never had the chance to show off. That was no excuse to gush right now, though. He suppressed the urge to keep boasting. It's pretty embarrassing, actually. Well, yeah, that's about it. Wow! That's amazing, Lord Momonga. The sparkles in the kid's eyes made him want to break into a huge grin. Trying to keep a straight face, not that his expressions came through so well via his skull anyway, he continued speaking. Anyhow, I'd like to do some experiments. Can you get things ready for me? Yes, sir. Understood. I'll begin preparations right away. And then, is it okay if we watch? Sure, I don't mind. I'm the only one who can hold it, so you should at least have a look. Yes, shouted Aura, bouncing around so cute and joyful. Mare couldn't hide how happy he was either. His long ears were twitching. Oh man. Hey, dignified expression of mine. No slipping, Momonga told himself, mobilizing all his willpower. Oh, and Aura, I've called all the floor guardians here. They should arrive in less than an hour. Huh? Then, we have to get ready to welcome the... No, don't worry about that. You can just wait for them here. If you say so, All the floor guardians? So Shaltair will be here too? All the floor guardians. Ah. Her ears suddenly drooped. Mare seemed more or less okay. The backstory had Aura not getting along with Shaltair very well, but his case must have been different. How are they going to react? Momonga whispered under his breath. A party of about 50 riders galloped across a grassy plain. All of them were equally brawny, but one stood out from all the rest. There was no word more fitting for him than robust. It was plain, even through his breastplate, that his whole body was covered in bulging muscles. He was in his 30s. Deep creases formed when he knit his tan brow. His black hair was neatly trimmed and his black eyes gleamed with the sharpness of a dagger. The rider next to him spoke. Captain, we've almost reached the first village on our patrol. Yes, it seems that way, Vice Captain. This was Gazef Stronov, pride of the Riestais, kingdom and captain of its guard. The village had not yet appeared down his line of sight. Suppressing his impatience, Gazef maintained a steady speed. Though they weren't driving their horses to exhaustion, it had been quite a march from the royal capital to here. A hint of fatigue had taken up root in his core. Certainly the same could be said for the horses. It wouldn't do to burden them any further. But I really hope it's nothing. The vice captain spoke again. His voice betrayed his anxiety, and Geza felt the same. The mission the king had given them was to find the Imperial Knights spotted near the kingdom's border and subdue them. Under normal circumstances, it would have been faster to send soldiers from the nearby city of Rantel, but the Empire's knights were strong and well outfitted. The gap between them and the kingdom's recruits was clear. The only soldiers in the kingdom that had a chance against the knights were the ones directly under Gazef. But it was foolish to leave everything up to them like this. Even just mobilizing some troops to guard the villages until Gazef and his men arrived would probably have been enough to stave off the enemy. There were plenty of other options as well. Just currently, they weren't no, they couldn't be, taken. Gazef knew why, and it irritated him to no end. He did his best to relax his grip on the reins, but he couldn't extinguish the blaze of his inner emotions. Captain, it's ridiculous for us to get to the village and then begin the search. And since you brought all of us, couldn't we divide up the labor? Or better yet, we could hire some adventurers from Yggdrasil and ask them to find the knights. Why are we doing it like this? Don't say that, Vice Captain. Nothing good will come of everyone finding out there are Imperial knights throwing their weight around inside the kingdom's borders. Captain, there's no one to hear us now. I want you to tell me the truth. A faint smile played across the Vice Captain's face, but it was the exact opposite of a kindly grin. Are the nobles interfering? The Vice Captain practically spat the words, and Gazef didn't reply, because the answer was yes. So the damned nobles plan to use the victims as pawns in their power struggle? And since this area is directly under the king's jurisdiction, I suppose they'll use any suffering as an excuse to make snide remarks. Not all the nobles think that way. I'm sure there are some who, like you say, think of the people, like the Golden Princess. But how many? If the king could just take absolute power like the emperor next door, he could ignore the damned nobles and focus on the people. If we force things, sides will be taken and the country will split, causing an internal conflict with an expansionist empire next door would be even worse for the people. I know, but let's drop it for now. Leaving it at that, Gazef pursed his lips and turned his penetrating gaze forward. Black smoke rose from beyond a small hill up ahead, and not just one or two trails. There wasn't a man present who didn't know what that meant. Gazef clicked his tongue and kicked his spurs into his horse's flanks. The scene that flooded their vision when they crested the hill was what they had expected. The village had been burned to ashes. The scattered house wreckage still standing was like grave markers. Gazef gave orders in a steely voice. Company, begin maneuvers, on the double. The village was burned to the ground. Only the collapsed remains of houses still bore any resemblance to their former shape. Walking through the wreckage, everything smelled like charred ashes mixed with the stench of blood. Gazef's face was steady, no trace of emotion, but that itself showed most clearly what he must have been feeling. The same went for the vice captain, walking beside him. Of the more than 100 villagers, only 6 had survived. The rest had been massacred, women and children alike, even infants. Vice Captain, escort the survivors to Yggdrasil. Please don't do this. That would be the most. You're right, it's a foolish plan, but we can't just leave them here like this. Yggdrasil was directly under the king's jurisdiction, and protecting these villages was his job. If they abandoned the survivors, it would be a terrible blow to the king. And it was easy to see that the nobles trying to corner him would make noise about it too. And more importantly, please rethink this. We should retreat to Yggdrasil for the time being and get ourselves in order. That's impossible. Captain, I'm sure you realize, but this must be a trap. The timing of the attack on the village lines up too well with our arrival in Yggdrasil. They waited for us before committing this atrocity. I'd even venture to say that the fact that they didn't kill every last person means it can't be anything but a trap. The survivors hadn't managed to escape the knights by running and hiding. The attackers just didn't kill them. Their aim was probably to force the military to divide their strength to protect them. Captain, you can't mean that you're going to chase them down knowing full well it's a trap. That was my intention. Are you serious? Captain, it's true that you're strong. I'm sure you could fight 100 knights and come out victorious. But the Empire has a caster. If that old man is with them, it's risky, even for you. You're not fully outfitted right now, so losing to the four wouldn't be out of the question either. So I'm begging you, please withdraw. No matter how many more villages fell, losing you would be a bigger loss for the kingdom. In response to Gaz's silence, the vice captain continued with pain in his voice. If you can't withdraw, then let's all leave the survivors and go after them. That is probably the wisest choice, but it would mean abandoning lives that could be saved. Do you really think they could make it if we left them here on their own? The vice captain had no response. He knew the chances were slim. If they didn't provide an escort and take them somewhere safe, they'd be gone within a few days. Still, the vice captain said, he had to say, Captain, the most valuable life here is yours. We can't be worried what happens to the villagers. Gazef knew it was killing the vice captain to say such things, and he was angry at himself for forcing the issue, but he still couldn't accept it. I was born a commoner. You were too, right? Yes, I aspired to the select because I looked up to you. You lived in a village, right? Yes, that's why. Death is like a next-door neighbor when you live in a village. It's not so rare for a monster to attack and kill people, right? Right? Mere soldiers can't always handle a monster. If you don't have the money to hire a specialist in monster extermination, an adventurer, all you can do is lie low until it leaves. Right? So didn't you ever hope? Hope that a noble would appear in your hour of need? That someone with power would come and save you? It'd be a lie if I said I didn't, but no one ever came. At least the nobles of the domain we belong to never gave us any financial help. So let's show them we're different. We're going to save the villagers. The vice captain's voice caught as he remembered his past. Vice captain, let's show them that there are people out there who will risk their lives despite the danger, that there are strong who will protect the weak. The men's eyes met and exchanged a multitude of emotions. Finally, the vice captain spoke, sounding tired but aiming to convey his passion. Then I'll take my men and go. I may be replaceable, but you're not. Don't be absurd. There's a better chance we make it back alive if I go too. We don't go to our deaths. We go to save the people. The vice captain's mouth worked for a moment, then closed. I'll choose who will escort the villagers to Yggdrasil right away. As the sky reddened, human shapes began to appear one after another on the grassy plain. There were 45 of them. The way they appeared out of nowhere was not due to camouflage, but magic. One glance was enough to tell they were not mercenaries, travelers, or adventurers. They all looked the same, clad in armored clothing, woven out of special metallic thread to prioritize mobility and defense. Due to magical fortification, however, these clothes had even greater defense, and in fact were more effective than a full suit of armor. Their leather bags weren't very full and didn't seem like the kind of thing someone on a journey would carry. That is, as long as they weren't also magic. The specially made belts around their waists held multiple potions, and the mantles draped across their backs radiated magical auras. Gathering enough magical items for all those people would have been no easy feat, either of coin or in terms of time and effort. Being so well equipped was proof that they had nation-level support behind them. Despite that, there was nothing on any of their gear displaying their rank or affiliation. In other words, they were an unlawful group with reason to hide. They looked toward the abandoned village. Gazing upon the ruins enveloped in the stench of burning and blood produced not a flicker of emotion in their eyes. They looked on coolly, as if it were a matter of course. We let him get away, huh? A low voice spoke with a hint of disappointment. There was nothing we could do. Have our decoy continue attacking villages. We must lead the beast to its cage. The man's sharp gaze followed Gazef and the others as they headed away. "Tell me where the decoy should strike next." 3 Momonga prepared to cast a spell, stretching his fingers out slowly toward a straw figure set up in a corner of the arena. The magic he specialized in was more about secondary effects, like insta-death, than simply dealing damage. For that reason, it didn't work so well on non-living targets. A situation like this called for straightforward damage-dealing magic, but he had chosen his class's ghost tree and beefed up his repertoire with those type of spells. As a result, in terms of damage dealt, he was a few tiers behind magic users who specialized in combat spells. Momonga peeked at the children. Their eyes sparkled with curiosity. The anxiety of whether he could live up to their expectations or not weighed him down. Next, he stole a glance in a different direction, where there were 2 huge monsters. They stood 10 feet tall with inverted triangle figures. Muscles rippled over frames that were a combination of human and dragon. Covering the muscles were scales harder than steel. The monsters had dragon-like faces and tails thick as tree trunks. Despite the lack of wings, they looked very much like dragons standing upright. In their arms, thicker than a man's torso, they each held some kind of weapon, a sword, a shield, that was half as long as they were tall. They were dragonkin, employed by Aura via her beast tamer skills to keep the arena clean. They were only level 55 and had no special abilities to speak of, but the punches they could dish with their strong arms, paired with their seemingly inexhaustible health, meant they could hold their own against higher-level monsters. Breathing a little quickly, Momonga turned back to the straw figure. Honestly, having everyone watching with such high expectations is putting me on the spot. The point of this exercise was to check if he could even use a spell or not. The reason he'd allowed Aura and Mare to watch was so he could show them his power before the others arrived and teach them how foolish it would be to oppose him. Of course, it was impossible for him to imagine these children betraying him, and there was certainly no sign that they might do such a thing. But Momonga wasn't confident they would remain loyal to him if it turned out he had lost the ability to cast spells. Aura interacted with him as if they were old acquaintances, but from Momonga's perspective, they might as well have met for the first time. Of course, her background was all based on ideas from the guild, and both of the children were guild member-created treasures, but it wasn't as if all their behavioral patterns, their responses to any situation, were set in stone. There was definitely what Momonga supposed could be called a loophole in their settings. If they were intelligent living things that thought and behaved autonomously, they would eventually come across a situation that their bios did not prepare them for. And how would things turn out if there was nothing in there about devoting themselves to their master even if he was weak? Actually, there were probably more cases where loyalty was not specified at all, in which case obeying orders or not all came down to individual judgment. If disobeying was as far as it went, that was fine. But what if someone wanted to rebel against the guild master if they thought he wasn't cutting it? Being more skeptical than necessary was a problem, but it was also stupid to blindly trust them. I'll just have to feel it out as I go. That was what made the most sense to Momonga under the circumstances. His other aim in having the twins there was to get advice in the event he couldn't cast a spell. They thought he was there to test the staff. He already knew magic items worked, so he could wield as much deception as necessary. My plan is perfect. He patted himself on the back and wondered if he had always been so sharp and composed, but there was no one who could answer that question for him. Momonga cleared the doubts from his mind and considered the magic he'd been able to use in Yggdrasil. The total number of magic spells in Yggdrasil, from tiers 1 to 10, plus super tier, was well over 6,000. These were split into various trees, But of the total, Momonga could use 718. Normally, a level 100 player could use about 300, so that was an insane amount. Not only that, but he'd memorized them all so he could choose the most appropriate spell for every situation, including this one. First, since friendly fire was on, he had to know what the area of effect would look like, so he would have to select a spell not based on how many enemies, but based on the area. And if this is my target, then in Yggdrasil, all he'd had to do to cast a spell was tap an icon, but he couldn't do that anymore, so he had to find another way. He thought he might already have it partially mastered. He focused on the powers deep inside him, just as he had when he'd turned off negative touch. Just imagine there are icons floating in the air. He laughed to himself. I got it. He had a perfect grasp of what the area of effect would be and how much time it would take before he could cast again. The confidence in his ability came with a serious high, the fulfillment and satisfaction of knowing that his magic was truly his own power. He'd never felt like this in Yggdrasil, as if transmuting the delight that had bubbled up inside him. His swiftly calming mind intensified the high. He gathered it at his fingertips and spoke the word of power. Fireball! A ball of flames grew from the tip of his finger, shot off at the straw figure he was pointing at, and hit just where he'd aimed. The ball burst on impact, instantly scattering the flames it had contained. The expanded flames raged through the area, even scorching the ground in a flash. The whole thing had only taken a second. Nothing was left of the straw figure but burned-up remains. Ha ha! Momonga let slip a laugh only he knew the meaning of, and the twins looked on, puzzled. Aura, ready another straw figure. Oh yes, sir. Right away. Hurry and set it up. One of the dragonkins stood a new figure next to the charred one. Momonga walked leisurely over, turned toward the straw figure, and cast a spell. Napalm. It went slightly astray but suddenly formed a column of flames that then engulfed the area and swirled up into the sky. After a beat, Momonga cast another spell at the figure that had been reduced to debris. Fireball! The figure was obliterated on impact. The spell's cooldowns were the same as in Yggdrasil. Actually, since for an area of effect spell, he didn't have to first select the spell and then aim by moving the cursor showing the area, he might have been able to cast even faster. Perfect. His satisfaction took the form of this remark, voiced of its own accord. Lord Momonga, should I prepare some more straw figures? Aura did seem puzzled. She knew from before that Momonga possessed incredible power, so she probably didn't understand what was such a big deal about stunts like this. But that was exactly the impression he'd wanted to make on the twins, so their confused expressions were proof of his success. No, that won't be necessary. I want to test something else now. Once he'd declined Aura's request, he set about his next objective. Message. First, he would try to contact a GM. The way the message spell worked in Yggdrasil was that if the player being contacted were in the game at the time, the caller would hear a cell phone-like ring, but if they weren't, it would just disconnect. Now it was maybe a cousin of that spell. Momonga felt like he was putting out a feeler to search for something. The sensation was difficult to describe, and he was experiencing it for the first time in his life. It continued for a little while, and then, with nothing to connect to, the spell timed out. Well, that's discouraging. He repeated the same spell, this time not aimed at a GM. He was calling the old members of Ainz Ooal Gown. He attempted it with 1% hope, feeling 99% like nothing would come of it. And as expected, there was no response. After calling all 40 members and confirming no response from anyone, he slowly shook his head. He'd known it was hopeless, but getting slapped in the face with reality was quite a downer. He cast the spell once more at Sebas. It connected, so it was clear that message was indeed, alas, working. There was still the possibility that it would only connect to characters in this world, but Lord Momonga? The deeply deferential voice echoed in his head. Momonga wondered if Sebas was bowing on the other end, like a businessman in the real world would have been. Sebas must have been unsure how to interpret the silence caused by Momonga's extraneous musing because he spoke again, sounding perplexed. Is something wrong? Oh, sorry. It seems I spaced out for a moment. By the way, what's it like out there? We're on a grassy plain, and I haven't been able to confirm the existence of any intelligent life. A grassy plain? No bogs? The great tomb of Nazarick used to be located deep in a swamp inhabited by frog-like people known as Sveiks. The whole area was covered by mist, and there were poisonous bogs here and there. No, just a grassy plain. Momonga laughed in spite of himself. Who knows what the heck is going on now? So Nazarick as a whole has been teleported to some unknown location? Sebas, is there anything up in the sky? Any signs or signals? No, nothing like that. Just the same night sky as the 6th level. What? A night sky, huh? There's nothing else in the area that catches your eye? No, not in particular. Aside from the great tomb of Nazarick, I don't even see any man-made structures. I see. What could he say? The only thing left for him to do was rip his hair out, although somewhere in his mind he had been prepared for this possibility. Sebas's silence indicated he was awaiting direction. Momonga glanced at the band on his left wrist. There were about 20 minutes until the other guardians would arrive, in which case there was only one order that made sense to give. Be back in 20 minutes. Once you've returned to the tomb, come to the amphitheatrum. I'm assembling all the guardians, so I'll have you report what you've seen. Understood. Okay, get as much information as you can before then. After getting Sebas's confirmation, he ended the spell. Just as he was thinking he'd take a break, having finished everything he needed to do for the moment, he remembered the two children and their expectant gazes. He needed to show them the power of the staff of Ainz Ooal Gown, since he'd said he would. He took the staff into his hand, but couldn't decide what magic to unleash. It was as if all its countless powers were begging to be used. I should probably go for something pretty showy. So he chose the fire orb, and from among its powers cast Summon Primal Fire Elemental. Obeying Momonga's will, power stirred within a jewel in one of the snake's mouths. Sensing that the flow of power was adequate, he pointed the staff. A huge sphere of light grew at the end, and an incredible storm of flames whipped up around it. The vortex rapidly expanded to a diameter of 13 feet and a height of about 20 feet. The crimson purgatory kicked up a hot wind, and out of the corner of his eye, Momonga saw the dragonkin move in front of Aura and Mar to protect them. His robe flapped in the waves of heat. It could have easily burned him, given the temperature, but Momonga had compensated for the weakness to fire he shared with all undead with perfect resistance, so he was unaffected. After increasing its size by consuming all the air in its vicinity, the swaying tornado of flames emitted a glow like fusing iron and took on a humanoid shape. The primal fire elemental was one of the highest level elementals, falling in the upper 80s range. Momonga felt the same connection with it that he had with the moon wolves. Whoa! A gasp escaped Aura's lips as she marveled at the monster. It was impossible to call forth such an elite elemental with regular summoning magic, and the look on her face was like a kid who'd gotten the toy she'd always wanted. Want to try fighting it? Huh? What? She was lost for a moment, but then the natural smile of a child played across her face. Actually, for a child, it was a bit, well, rather twisted. Mare's expression was more childlike. You'll let us fight it? Sure, I don't mind. It's no big deal if it gets defeated. Momonga shrugged. The staff's power allowed him to summon one a day. In other words, it didn't matter if this one got taken down because he could summon another one the next day. I just remembered something I have to do. Mare. She grabbed him with an iron grip when he tried to make a run for it. Apparently, she wasn't going to let him escape. She snagged him with her smile. To Momonga, it was the smile of an adorable little girl, but he wondered if it looked different to someone with the same face. Mare was scared stiff. Aura dragged him in front of the primal fire elemental. His eyes darted around seeking succor, finally finding Momonga. In reply to his radiant ear-to-ear grin, Momonga joined his palms to mimic a prayer. The light on Mar's face went out. "Well, don't overdo it, you two. It'd be silly to get hurt." "We won't," Aura responded cheerfully. Mare's voice was there too, but gloomy, like he was being escorted to his doom. Momonga figured they wouldn't get hurt as long as Mare was there, so he used his connection to the primal fire elemental to order it to attack. The twins engaged the roaring flames of the attacking elemental, with Aura forward and Mar in back. Aura double-wielded her whips to lash the hovering monster into submission, and Mare's magic steadily racked up damage. Yeah, I figured this would be no problem for them. The battle may have been one-sided, but he continued to watch while he went over in his head the other things he had to investigate. He'd already confirmed that magic and some items worked, but there were still other items he wanted to check, most importantly, scrolls, staves, and wands. Objects like these contained magic. Scrolls were single-use, while staves and wands came with a certain amount of casts. Momonga possessed quite a few of these. He was the type that felt using up consumables was a waste. He refused to use the highest-grade recovery potions, even on the final boss. He'd gone beyond cautious to plain stingy, so his inventory had just piled up. In Yggdrasil, they'd been stored in his item box, but where were they now? Recalling how he used to open his item box, he stretched his fleshless hand into the air. He felt it slip into something. It was almost like breaking the surface tension of water. He was sure for an onlooker it must have looked like part of his arm had disappeared into the air. Then, as if he were opening a window, he made a broad sliding motion to the side. A window did open, right in the air, and inside were several staves lined up all neat and tidy. This was definitely Yggdrasil's item box. He moved his hand to scroll through what he supposed one could call his inventory screen. Scrolls, wands, weapons, armor, decorations, jewels, potions, and other consumables. He had a vast number of magical tools. Momonga's face broke into a relieved smile. With all this, I should be able to protect myself, even if everyone in the tomb turns against me. Still absent-mindedly keeping his eye on Aura and Mar's fierce battle, Momonga summarized all the information he'd collected so far. Are the NPCs I've met programs? No. They were beings with consciousness just like humans. It was impossible to capture such subtle emotions with code. He needed to assume that they were no longer programs, but had somehow become equivalent to humans. And what is this world? That was unclear. Considering Yggdrasil's magic existed, it would be valid to suppose he was inside the game, but taking into account the previous answer, that couldn't possibly be the case. That said, it was either the game world or some other world, one of the two. Not that either made any sense. How should I conduct myself? He'd confirmed that he could use his powers as he could in Yggdrasil. So if all the NPCs and monsters in the Great Tomb of Nazarick were also based on Yggdrasil data, he would have no enemies. The problem would be if there were something not from Yggdrasil, but all he could do was cross that bridge when he came to it. For now, he had to just act with the dignity of a ruler, assuming he could muster such a thing. What's the plan? Work to gather information. He didn't know what this world was, and at the moment he was like an ignorant tourist. He needed to keep his wits about him and cautiously gather as much information as he could. Say this is some other world. Should I try to get back to mine? Good question. If he'd had any friends, he'd probably try to go back. If his parents were still alive, he'd risk his life to find a way back. If he'd had a family to take care of or a lover, But he had none of those things. He went to the office, worked, came home, and slept. Up until now, he'd log on to Yggdrasil and keep things ready in case any of his guildmates wanted to come back. But he didn't even have that anymore. Was there any point in going back to such a world? But if he could get back, then he knew he should put in the effort. One could never have too many options. The world outside the tomb could very well be hell. Okay, what do I do? Momonga's lonely words to himself evaporated into the air. 4. The primal fire elemental's gigantic body disappeared as if melting into the air, and the heat that had been thrown around the area rapidly dissipated. Momonga also felt the bond of dominance he'd been vaguely aware of break. The primal fire elemental had extraordinary destructive power and stamina, but for Aura, who demonstrated impressive evasive action and had complete immunity to the fire damage that had been hitting everything in the area, it might as well have been target practice. Of course, if she had gotten hit, she would have lost a significant portion of her health. But Mare, as a druid, would never let that happen. He used an appropriate mix of buffs and debuffs to support her. Their style of fighting was a magnificent division of roles between forward and rear positions. Momonga was struck both by that and by how raw the action had felt. It had been a real fight, not something from a game. Magnificent. You were both wonderful. The children smiled at his heartfelt words of admiration. Thank you, Lord Momonga. It's been a while since we've gotten such a workout. The two of them casually wiped the sweat from their faces, but the moment they did, it beaded up again and began to drip down their tan skin. Momonga silently opened his item box and took something out for the first time in this world, the bottomless pitcher of water. Yggdrasil had systems for eating and thirst, etc., but since Momonga was undead, none of them applied to him, so he had never used the item himself. He'd been using it for his mounts. The pitcher was made out of a transparent material that seemed like glass and was filled to the brim with fresh water. Perhaps due to how cold the water was, countless droplets had condensed on the outside of the container. Next, he took out 2 clean glasses, filled them, and offered them to the twins. Aura, Mare, please drink this. What? We couldn't possibly, Lord Momonga. Yeah, we don't need to trouble you for that. I can make water with my magic. Aura waved her hands in polite refusal, and Mare shook his head quickly back and forth. Seeing them like that made Momonga wince. Oh, come on, it's water. Just a small token of my thanks for all your hard work. Ah! Oh! Aura and Mare, blushing, nervously reached out their hands to take the glasses. Thank you, Lord Momonga. I can't believe you're pouring drinks for us. Does it really make you that happy? This time, Aura didn't refuse, but took the glass in both hands and gulped it down. The movements of her throat were clearly visible, and water that overflowed from the corners of her lips ran down her lustrous neck and disappeared into her chest. Mare, meanwhile, held the cup in one hand and took measured sips. The difference in their personalities was made abruptly apparent just from the way they drank. Watching them, Momonga brought a hand to his own throat. It felt like there was a membrane stretched directly over his cervical spine. He hadn't felt thirsty since entering this body, or tired. He understood that it was only natural for an undead to not feel any of those things, but the idea of not being human anymore seemed like it had to be a joke. He felt around his body some more. Skin, flesh, blood vessels, nerves, organs. He was missing all manner of things. He had a body made solely of bone. He'd known that, but now he groped around so it would sink in. His sense of touch was slightly dull compared to when he was human, almost like there was a thin cloth between him and anything he went to touch. Meanwhile, his other senses performed outstandingly. His hearing and vision were extremely sharp. Since his body was built entirely of bones, it seemed like it could break at any moment, but he also had the sense that each bone was more solid than steel. Although this body was completely different from his old one, there was a strange satisfaction and sense of fulfillment knowing it was his. Perhaps that was why he wasn't frightened by his transformation. Want another glass? He held up the bottomless pitcher and offered once the children had finished their water. Nope. That was enough for me. I see, Mare. How about you? Oh, I'm okay. My throat's not dry anymore. Momonga nodded, took the glasses back, and put them away into the air. I thought you were more scary, Lord Momonga, Aura said softly. Oh, really? I can be scarier if you like. No, I like you better like this. Way better. Then I'll stay like this. Aura's animated response had thrown him off a bit. You're not this nice only to us, are you? Momonga didn't know how to respond to her quiet murmurs, so he just patted her on the head several times. Ha, ha. She was like a puppy presented with its favorite food. Mare looked on jealously. Suddenly they heard a voice. Oh, am I the first? It sounded younger than one might expect from the tone. At the same time, a shadow spread across the ground, rose up out of it, and took on the shape of a door. Then someone walked slowly through. Her whole body was wrapped in a soft-looking raven-black ball gown with a full, wide skirt. She covered up on top with a bolero cardigan featuring frills and ribbons. Add to all that her fingerless lace gloves, and almost all her skin was hidden from view. Only her shapely face, unparalleled was the right word to describe it, was visible, its almost waxy white skin exposed. Her long silver hair was gathered to one side and up, so not a strand of it fell in her face. Her crimson eyes had a weirdly jubilant look in them. She was 14 or possibly younger. There was still some child in her, and her beauty was born of that mix of cuteness and adult attractiveness. One thing that was out of balance, however, was how big her chest was for her age. Teleportation is restricted in Nazarick for a reason. Don't just go using a gate. You entered the arena the normal way, so couldn't you have just kept walking, Shaltir? An exasperated voice sounded right next to Momonga. The icy tone had nothing of the puppyishness of just a moment ago. On the contrary, it was full to overflowing with hostility. Next to Aura, Mar began trembling again. It was probably wise of him to be inching away from his sister. Even Momonga was a bit alarmed by the sudden change in her. The girl Shaltir, who had arrived using the highest level of teleportation magic, cast not so much as a glance at Aura, but stood squirming a bit before Momonga. She smelled pleasantly like perfume. You reek, Aura muttered softly, adding that maybe her undead body rotting was to blame. Perhaps because she had caught Momonga instinctively lifting his arm to check if he smelled. A dark blue vein stood up on Shaltir's forehead. Oh, come now, you can't say that. Lord Momonga is undead too. Huh, what are you talking about? Lord Momonga is not regular undead. Pretty sure he's like super undead or godly undead or something. Hearing Shaltir and Mare express their satisfaction with such an explanation. Oh, right. Momonga felt somewhat insignificant. I don't know what it's like here, but at least in Yggdrasil I was just plain undead. More to the point, super undead and godly undead didn't exist. Still, what you said was kind of bad. You think so? Okay then, take two. Ahem. Maybe it's cause of your rotting dead flesh. Yes, I suppose that will do. Accepting Aura's second take, Shaltir slipped her arms around Momonga's neck to embrace him. Ah, my master, the sole being I cannot conquer. Her wet tongue showed itself between her parted red lips. It moved over them as if it were its own separate animal. From her open mouth came sweet-smelling breath. All of this would have been extremely becoming of a bewitchingly beautiful adult, but at her age, something was off. The awkward mismatch was even a bit endearing. In the first place, she wasn't tall enough, so instead of embracing him, it just seemed like she was trying to hang from his neck. Despite all that, Momonga was unaccustomed to attention from women and was plenty bewitched. He nearly took a step backward but made up his mind to stand still. Was her personality always like this? He couldn't get the question out of his mind. But since the one who wrote her backstory was Peroncino, it was entirely possible that this was just how she was. That guy loved porn games more than anything, and had even adopted "porn games are my life" as his personal catchphrase. And that good-for-nothing had written the bio of Shaltir Bloodfallen. She was the guardian of levels 1 through 3 and a true vampire, as well as a little girl who'd been given a pile of X-rated video game character traits. "I think that's enough." Shaltir responded to the low, hard voice and sneered at Aura. "Oh, hello, Squirt. I didn't see you there." Momonga didn't feel like bothering to point out that they'd just been talking a moment ago. Ignoring Aura and her twitching, irritated expression, Shaltir addressed Mare. "It must be hard for you to have such an odd elder sister. You should get some distance from her as soon as possible. If you don't, you might end up the same way." Mare's face went sickly pale. He knew she was using him to pick a fight with his sister. But Aura smiled. "Shut up, Miss Fake Boobs." She dropped a bomb. "How'd you know?" "Ooh, she broke character," Momonga said to himself. There was no sign of her forced elegant cool. "One glance is enough to tell. Look how bizarrely poofy they are. How many layers of padding did you use?" "Wah! Wah!" Shaltir flailed her hands as if to erase the words out of the air. Now she looked her age. Meanwhile, Aura had an evil grin on her face. "If you use that much padding, I bet they must shift around when you run, huh?" "Yeek!" Shaltir emitted a strange scream now that she was caught. "Bullseye! Neh-ha-ha! Your boobs slip, so that's why you used a gate, so you could get here in a hurry without having to run." "Shut it, Pipsqueak. You don't have any. I at least have I'm pretty big." Shaltir frantically fired back, but Aura only grinned even more evilly. Shaltir took a step back as if she'd been shoved. The fact that she was trying to inconspicuously shield her chest was kind of sad. "I'm still only 76. I've got plenty of time ahead of me. It must be tough being undead with no future. You don't grow." "Ugh!" Shaltir groaned and retreated farther. She had no comeback for that, and it showed plainly on her face. Aura noted this and stretched her slit-like grin even farther. "You should be satisfied with what you got. Pfft. Now that you said it, you can't take it back." Shaltir's gloved hands began to exude a shimmering black haze. Aura had her whips ready to intercept. Before the two of them stood a flustered Mare. Momonga felt like he was watching a scene from the past and couldn't decide whether to stop them or not. Peroncino, who had created Shaltir, and Bubbling Teapot, who had created Aura and Mare, were brother and sister. They used to have good-natured squabbles sometimes, like this. Momonga almost felt he could see the shadows of his former guildmates fighting behind the two NPCs. What a racket! Momonga was basking in reminiscences of his old guildmates when the hard, twisted voice of something not human speaking human words stopped Aura and Shaltir's quarrel short. Standing in the direction from which the voice came, who knew how long he'd been there, was a grotesque, throwing a chill into the air. He looked like an 8-foot-tall bipedal insect. If there were such a thing as a combination of an utterly demonic mantis and an ant, it'd probably look like this. From his sturdy tail that was double his height, and the rest of his body sprouted countless icicle-like spikes. His horizontally closing lower jaws were surely powerful enough to sever a human arm with no trouble. 2 of his arms carried a silver halberd, and the other 2 held a horrifying yet excellently made mace, giving off a sinister black aura, and a broadsword so warped it seemed impossible for it to ever be sheathed. He was wrapped in a chill that sparkled like diamond dust, and his light blue exoskeleton was like armor. His back and shoulders bulged like icebergs. This was the guardian of the 5th level, sovereign of the frozen river, Cocytus. He struck the ground with the blade of his halberd, and the earth around it slowly froze. "You amuse yourselves too much before a supreme being. She's being disrespectful to. I'm just telling the truth. Urgh. Mare panicked as Shaltir and Aura glared at each other again, eyes fearsomely flashing. Momonga was over it all by now and warned them both in a voice he made deep on purpose. Shaltir, Aura, that's enough playing around for now. Both of them jumped and then hung their heads in unison. I'm sorry. He nodded to generously accept their apology and then turned to the newly arrived figure. Thanks for coming, Cositus. I come immediately when you call, Supreme One. White breath escaped from between Cositus's mandibles, and in response came a cracking noise, as if the moisture in the air were freezing solid. It was a cold on par with the heat of the primal fire elemental. Just being near him was enough to cause all sorts of low-temperature status effects and physical damage, but Momonga didn't feel a thing. Though really, there was no one in the room who didn't have some way to resist fire, chill, and acid attacks. Have you been bored with no raiders these days? There certainly hasn't been much going on. His mandibles clicked. It sounded like the threatening clicks of an angry hornet, but Momonga chose to think he must be laughing. But that said, I have things to do, so I can't say I've been bored. Oh, things to do? Do you mind telling me what? Training so that I may be of use to you at any time. Cositus, not that it was apparent from the way he looked, was a warrior, both personality-wise and by design. Of those in the great tomb of Nazarick who used weapons, he had the highest attack power. To be of use to me? Thanks. Hearing that single word makes it all worth it. Oh, it seems Demiurge and Albedo have arrived. Following Cositus's line of sight, Momonga saw two shadows near the entrance of the arena. Albedo was in front. A man followed behind her, as if in attendance. When they'd gotten closer, Albedo smiled and bowed deeply to Momonga. The man also gave an elegant bow before speaking. Sorry to keep you all waiting. He was about 6 feet tall, with skin the shade of a suntan. He had Asian features, and his jet-black hair was slicked back. The eyes behind his round glasses were not so much slivers as closed. He wore a 3-piece suit with a necktie and had the air of a shrewd businessman or lawyer. Even though he presented himself as a gentleman, he couldn't hide his evil nature. Behind him stretched a silver-plated tail with 6 spines on the tip. This man, scattering dark, flickering flames, was creator of the Inferno, Demiurge. He was the demon who commanded NPC defense operations and the guardian of the 7th level. This is everyone, then. Lord Momonga, it seems we're still missing 2. It was a voice that wormed its way into hearts and drew one in with its richness. All Demiurge's words came with a passive skill called Incantation of Influence. It was a power that caused the weak-hearted who heard him to instantly become his puppets. That said, no one in the room was affected. It only worked on targets of level 40 and below, so all those present merely heard it as a particularly luscious voice and nothing more. Their presence isn't necessary. They've both been assigned to prioritize other tasks. We don't need to interrupt them for this. If that's all right, then... It seems my comrade is not here either. Aura and Shaltir stopped short. Even Albedo's smile froze. He's only a guard for one part of one of my floors. Yeah. Shaltir forced a smile, and Aura chimed in while Albedo nodded. Ah, the Prince of Fear? Well, we should probably notify the domain guardians as well. Please pass the information along to Crimson, Grant, and the others. I'll leave it up to each floor guardian. There were 2 types of guardians in the Great Tomb of Nazarick. One was the type that all those before Momonga now were, floor guardians who were each in charge of 1 or more levels. The other was domain guardians who guarded part of a level.